Tom Wood.
Nice to see you.
Great to see you. We've never met, Tom. I feel as though I know you so well because of Zoom. Yeah, because we've been on events.
That's right.
Launches and crime events.
I wasn't sure because, during our police careers we must have crossed paths at some stage.
I'm sure.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, never mind about all of that. Here we are.
Here we are. We're here now, and thanks for coming through to Glasgow. I know that's a big thing for an Edinburgh lad.
Well, I'm not quite. See, I'm to the west of Edinburgh, so I'm sort of half. I've got 1 foot. I've got 1 foot in West Lothian.
I had an old boss who used to say, Tom, there's only 2 types of detectives, Simon. Detectives who work in the south and detectives who wish they worked in the south. So I could use that with Glasgow.
That's an old one.
I can use that anywhere. Yeah. Tom, thanks for coming through. And the problem with you is where to start. So I suppose that police background is the place to start to set the scene, really. Mm-hmm. So you retired 2005?
I did, yeah.
As Assistant Chief Constable.
I was Deputy Chief.
Deputy Chief of Lothian and Borders Police.
Correct.
Just before, when did Police Scotland come in? 2010?
No, 2013.
All right. Well, we're already thinking about it back then.
Well, yeah, it was on the cards for a long time prior to my retirement, and you could see it coming. It was like a train crash in slow motion. You could see it coming. The truth was that the old 8-force model, which you and I worked in, was not viable. Right. Because some of the forces were simply too small. Yes. Now, when you look at the challenges of today with cyber and counter-terrorism and these historic investigations, the smaller forces would have had great difficulty finding the wherewithal to do that.
Of course.
So, but it was an object lesson to me because there was an alternative plan. The alternative plan was a 3 or 4 force model. But turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And during my time in ACPOS, the chief officers thing, that we could not persuade the senior officers of the smaller forces to come together in a meaningful way because they wanted to preserve their own identity and their own independence, and their politicians likewise. And you can understand that. But of course, what that meant is that if you don't design the future you want to become part of, somebody else is going to come and do it for you. And that's what happened.
The government took control of it.
That's what happened.
For political reasons more than anything.
Well, it was for fun. It was for financial reasons, really. And you see, the budget of Police Scotland just now is the budget, more or less, of 5 of the old 8 forces.
Okay.
So
something's got to give somewhere.
There is a saving of the cost of 3 of the old Scottish forces. Now that's quite substantial.
Yeah, definitely.
Now the problem with that, of course, is that demand has increased in a whole lot of ways, as we've discussed, with cyber and all these things. But none of the old crime types have gone away.
That's right.
There's not any less drug dealers on the road. There's not any less housebreakers. And so there's an old rule of physics which says you can't do more of one thing without doing less of another, given the same resource.
And you and I both know that with the cost of living crisis that we're just about to embark on, all these things, crime is going to rise and rise.
Crime's going to rise, and I think also there's a potential for unrest, civil unrest. Unless the government are fleet of foot, that I think there's a real prospect of that, because people are just at the end of their tether. And when they get a gas bill looking for, 5 times what they're paying, sort of stuff, it's just...
Okay, we could go down that road all day as well. Maybe we will someday.
We live in interesting times.
What we'll do is save that for your new podcast.
Yes, right.
We'll come back to that. Don't let me not mention your new podcast, because that's exciting, Tom. That's exciting news. But let's set the scene then. Joined the police. Where are you from originally, Tom?
I was born in Edinburgh.
Right.
I was born in Edinburgh. My father was a policeman. He was a detective in the 1950s.
Okay.
And I wanted to do something different. And my ambition was to join the Navy. Right. I was going to be a sailor. But at the time I was ready to join the Navy, it was just at the time when one of the Labour governments had scrapped all the ships. So I was told, and literally I was told, look, you can join the Navy if you like, but you won't go to sea. So that was a big thought. So I joined.
So it wasn't just a uniform.
No. I was a kind of an accidental policeman, as it were. But I was fortunate in that I joined Edinburgh City Police, which is a good sized force.
What year did you join?
1968.
Okay.
68. I joined just as a boy. I wasn't 19. And I joined the force, and it was a good time because it was a good size of force, and there was some very good senior hands working in it.
Yeah.
The war service men were just retiring, and I was lucky in that I got well trained and well tutored.
Yes.
And I do wonder, I don't know, but I do wonder whether that same level of training, and I'm talking about street training.
Yes.
I'm not talking about college training. I'm talking being taught the craft of policing, and there is a craft to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Of working a beat, of all that sort of stuff, and
dealing with people.
Dealing with people.
Keep your ears and eyes open.
Well, I'll tell you one thing.
Shut.
I'll tell you one thing that always strikes me. When you're walking along the street, I was taught when you're walking the beat and walking the street, you engage with everybody you meet. You eye to eye, you nod, you say hello or whatever. That's it. The number of young policemen I see now walking on the street with their eyes down.
Or chatting.
Or chatting to each other.
Just chat to each other as if they're out for a stroll.
And it's such a basic, it's such a fundamental of that policing. And I mean, if I had done that with my old tutor cop, a lovely man who became a good friend of mine, he would have cuffed my lug. Because he was the craft, the craft of working a beat.
This is another podcast. For sure, because I could go on all day about it. I remember going down the street with Archie Shaw, who was an old sergeant, and I was blethering. I was chatting. I don't know what I was chatting about. And he said to me, "Son, are you just going to talk shite all day?" And that was me put in my place. Because your job was to watch what was going on and to engage with people. And I loved it, Tom, because as a young cop in a strange town, I was posted away down in Argyll. When you made eye contact and smiled, everybody smiles or responds to the uniform. 99% of them positively. The other ones have disappeared up a close or whatever. And when you meet them again socially, or the next day walking down the street, it's a hello. And then the next time it's hello Simon, because they've asked somebody who's the new copper. And there's a bond building up right away that in rural communities becomes very important when the shit hits the fan.
Right, absolutely.
So it's a whole art form, walking a beat. I don't even know if we have any beats anymore.
Well, I don't know, but
I know we don't pull padlocks anymore or any of that stuff. These were all the rudimentary things.
My old tutor cop, he had a whole lot of people, contacts on his beat, who were actually informants. They didn't know they were informants.
Totally.
They just thought they were friends of
the local
policeman. But he would make sure that he touched base with people who worked late at night, who worked early in the morning, the kind of folk at that time the insomniacs who were always hanging out their windows and things like that in the middle of the city.
Totally.
Very, very clever. Very clever.
Because every common close has got a curtain twitcher.
Of course.
Every street has one.
Of course.
And the beatman's job was to know the curtain twitcher. He would tell them everything they needed to know.
Everything.
And we gleaned the benefit of that when things went pear-shaped.
Well, absolutely.
And we had to get some information from, you knew where to go and where to get it.
That's right.
Anyway, the good old days, eh?
Well, they were. Looking back, I was extremely fortunate. And then I was fortunate again. I was posted very quickly.
Where were you posted?
Well,
initially,
I worked in the city centre. I worked in Stockbridge, which is an old city centre, where that was a foot beat. And then I was posted to North Edinburgh, very, very busy station, as a panda driver, and right at the time when heroin was arriving.
Okay.
And
late 70s?
Mid to late 70s.
Okay.
We saw heroin arriving.
Edinburgh was the first in Scotland.
Well, I'm not sure it was the first. It was certainly the first to see it, and that was for a number of reasons. And that was because, as you know, fashion. There are fashions and trends, in particularly in heroin. For instance, in Newcastle, smoking, chasing the dragon was the
big thing.
In Edinburgh, it was right from the start. It was needles. It was injecting, and so we saw both the initial upsurge in crime that came from the heroin trade, but also very quickly we started to see overdoses.
Yes.
So the visible manifestation of it was there for us early. I'm not sure whether the actual drugs appeared any earlier. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
So that was the period you were on the streets?
Yeah, very busy time.
Attending calls?
Yeah, very busy time. And then I was always interested in in CID work, and I had a lot to do with crime. So I got myself into CID, and I found myself.
Did you do an aid to the CID?
Yep, I got onto the accelerated promotion course.
Right.
So I was a sergeant when I had 6 years service just.
Right.
And then when I came back, they put me straight into the CID.
Okay.
So I found myself a detective sergeant when I was about 27-year-old.
Superb.
With 8 or 9 people working for me in another very busy part of the city, in the south of the city, which was an equally challenged place in terms of drugs.
Is that Sighthill over that area?
No, Craigmillar.
Craigmillar, yeah.
Which I loved. And when I look back now, and I was very fortunate, I did a lot of interesting jobs in the police service. But these times, when I was a detective sergeant at Craigmillar and working at Muirhouse and Dry Law, were by far the best, the most formative.
Yeah.
That's where you learn the business.
Yes, totally.
And I was.
You're living on your wits.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing.
And you're interfacing with street crime.
Yeah.
And petty criminals.
Yeah.
But some serious criminals
Yes.
in amongst there as well.
Absolutely.
The whole spectrum.
And you're left.
And the victims.
And you're left to get on with it.
Yeah.
I mean, when I think of it now, at Craigmillar, there was myself, there was a team, we had about 6 or 7, I had 6 DCs in it, an aide or 2 aides, and you were just left to get on with it. There was no DI there.
Right.
So you were left to get on with it. And that's a fantastic opportunity.
Yeah.
Really, it was great. And then what happened then was, in the late 70s, we started to be hit by very prolonged murder investigations, the World's End murders, 1977. And what that did was that drew away a lot of experienced detectives to the squads. And the younger detectives, like myself, got a chance to do things and to handle investigations which you wouldn't normally have got.
Yep.
So again, and then of course you found yourself on these big squads.
Working with very seasoned detectives.
And working with other forces. And also, I had the opportunity, when I was doing the Robert Black case, worked on that for a couple of years.
What was the Robert Black case?
That was the abduction and murder of Caroline Hogg and Susan Maxwell and Sarah Hart.
Yes.
Cross-border case. And I found myself working with Northumbria and with Leicestershire. I also found myself working with the first Holmes computer systems.
Right.
So it was an incredible opportunity. Yeah. And I consider myself now very, very fortunate to have had that opportunity. And working with some very, very good people too.
I'm smiling because when Holmes came out, I was just in the serious crime squad. And I was only 4 years service or something. And the boss came to me and said, I want you to go on a course, son, blah, blah, blah. I said, what is it? He said, computers. And you know what I said to him? I said, with all due respect, sir, computers have never solved any murders. And I didn't go on the course. He said, well, don't bother then. And I never went. And from then on, I never got in the room where the Holmes, where everything was hinged from then on. Because we had the old carousels and that's about
But computers did solve murders.
They did, yeah, and still do.
And I'll tell you something, and not just that, but the old carousel systems that I worked with initially, when I think of it now, it was hugely flawed.
Yes, totally.
I mean, totally. I remember the incident rooms.
And the boss, the senior investigating officer, had so much. Everything was down to him.
There was these massive
carousel.
2 metre things, thousands of cars. And in our case, they were replicated because there was an incident room in Lothian, there was an incident room in Northumbria, there was an incident room in Leicestershire. Because of I mean, think of the error factor there. Yeah. And we were dead lucky.
Oh, handwritten.
Yes, aye. With
sometimes you could read them.
Everything. but we were
good. We were good.
We were fortunate. In Lothian, we were fortunate because in the early 1980s, we got an absolutely first-class chief constable, Bill Sullivan, who just died there a month or so ago, and one of the finest men I've ever met, and he got us money to get a computerised system. Right. Now, as a street cop, and I was the same, The chief constable, what do they do? You know, it's just, they just go about in big cars, what do they do? Well, I tell you what he did.
Mm-hmm.
He made sure we were properly funded and equipped.
Yeah.
And particularly in terms of...
He did the same. He got us the command and control system.
Yeah,
but apparently it was a choice between the command and control and a proper communication system. Because it was owned by radios.
Yeah, that's right.
Useless. But he went for the command and control, which was the big control room up at Pitt Street.
That's right.
That you used to get taken to as a young cop on tour to see it.
Yeah.
They called it Star Trek or something like that.
I remember it. You saw pictures of it now as well.
It's like looking at an old computer screen or something now.
That's right. So in a lot of ways, my police service was extremely fortunate.
Yeah.
And I was very privileged to work. And now you can look back and say I was very privileged to work.
Did you spend a chunk of your service? How many years did you do?
Well, 35.
Did you spend a chunk of that in the criminal investigation department?
A lot, yeah. I was a DS, I was a DI, I was a detective.
So you're back and forward. Yeah.
And then I was ACC crime.
Right.
And then as the deputy chief, I was director of operations. So, and then I ended up as being the officer in overall command of the World's End Operation Trinity, they called it, because it was the World's End murders, and it was also the murders of Anna Kenny, Agnes Cooney, and Hilda Macaulay. Yeah. In Strathclyde.
Yes, Anna Kenny was the one that I was just a young cop. I was probationer when Anna Kenny's body was found in Skipness. Yeah. And I refer to that in my book as well, because it was it's when I first met Serious Crime Squad detectives, I decided I want to be one of them, because the drinking looked like really good fun. So, the World's End murders, so you were involved in that inquiry? I
was involved in it off and on in all my service, really, and it ended up in 2004.
Because it was 77?
Yeah, 77, October 77, 16th October 77. And it went on, and of course, DNA came along, and thanks to the foresight of a young biologist, or really the whole forensic science side at Lothians, but one man, particularly Lester Knibb, who I give full credit to in my book about the World's End, he had the foresight to guard jealously, and I mean jealously, the forensic productions, so much so that when DNA came along, we managed to get a profile, and that led to the identification eventually of Angus Sinclair, who we then started to investigate in 2004. And I was just about to retire. I had done my time.
So that was a direct result of protection of the scene, protection of the productions, meticulous itemisation and careful analysis of the productions that were then stored properly.
Yeah, but not just that. It was also about a timeline, and it's not just, yes, it is about taking the productions properly at the time, but it's also about protecting them, and it's also about monitoring them throughout their time.
Chain of evidence.
Because the first thing that happens
is a lawyer's going to say,
where have these been? Where have they been? And the potential for contamination and reasonable doubt, all that stuff. So there was
I'm saying this for the benefit of any cops that might have to watch this.
Yeah, that's right.
Because to me it's sacrosanct.
Well, absolutely. But in the 1970s it wasn't that common.
No.
It wasn't.
No.
And
smoking at scenes and all sorts of things that went on.
And I always think, when you see these historic cases being discussed now, and wonderful new forensic science, and I always, shout at the television, but it's only any good if the job was done properly at the start. Yeah. And if the job wasn't done properly at the start, forget it. Yeah, forget it.
That takes us right back to Ruxton as well, strangely, doesn't it? But we'll get there.
Precisely.
So, when you left, what year did you leave the police?
2005.
Had you written any books by that point?
No. I don't. I
just reports, really. And you were assistant chief, so you didn't even do reports by that stage. You'd left that already.
Oh, yeah. Well, you think so? No, I done a lot of writing. Yeah. And of course, as the DCC, I've done a lot of disciplinary stuff and all that sort of stuff. But
definitely not going there.
But not anything we say. But what happened was, after I retired, the World's End came to court in 2007 of the first World's End trial, and quite frankly, it was a debacle.
Right.
It was a very poor prosecution, and the case was kicked out. And I was extremely distressed, as were a lot of people who had worked in it. This had been a huge team effort over the course of over 30 years. And we were absolutely...
Was Sinclair in custody anyway?
He was in custody anyway. He was
Right.
serving 2 life sentences.
Yes.
He wasn't going anywhere.
Right.
But we wanted to see him convicted,
Of course.
for the sake of the families,
Yes.
particularly Helen Scott's father,
And
who was surviving and had been a fantastic...
Charlotte Eady.
Sorry,
The other victim.
Christine.
Christine.
Helen Scott and Christine Eady.
Right.
So I thought, right, the only way I didn't want it defined, the case investigation defined simply as a legal cock-up. So I decided I had to write the book.
Okay.
And so I sat down and I wrote the book. And I was still working at the time, and I didn't really because I went straight from the police into another fairly busy job doing alcohol and drug policy. And I didn't really have time. So I got a friend of mine who had written books before, and together we wrote the first version of The World's End Murders. Now, a little hint to anybody watching this who is aspiring to be a writer. It's very, very difficult to co-author a book.
Okay.
Very difficult.
I can imagine.
Because your writing styles are different, and it was hard.
Yeah.
And if I had my time again, I was very grateful to David for helping me out. But if I had my time, if I had my time again, I would have done it differently. And in fact, I would very much like to rewrite sections of that book about the World's End, because at the time I wrote it, I was in some difficulty. First of all, I didn't want to get accused of abusing privileged information.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the second reason was that the first trial had concluded, but I was hopeful that there would be a second trial, because there was a lot of public heat over the miscarriage of justice, which it was. And so I had to be careful. I wrote it, and a lot of the key players were alive, and so I had to be careful how I wrote it. So it was very difficult, and I would like, in some senses, I would like to rewrite it, and I might revisit it in one of my future projects.
It's an anomaly in Scots law, that trial, because you and I are aware of it sold as a size, as they say, with the first trial. And I think it's the only case that's had a retrial, if you like.
No,
not a retrial, a new trial.
There's been 3 now.
In Scots law?
Yes, but the double jeopardy legislation was brought in specifically on the back of the World's End Murders.
Right.
So
you changed things.
I can so much. Well, I didn't.
How did you get it to? Well, how did we get it to that second trial then?
Well, there was a lot of public pressure. There was a lot of media. I wrote the book, which was published in 2008, which added to it.
There was new information then.
Yeah, but I have to give credit to 2 people who really championed it through. One was Kenny McCaskill, the Justice Secretary at the time, who really took it on, and the other was Frank Mulholland, who became the Lord Advocate. He's now a High Court judge, but he took it on, and because of the courage and the tenacity of these 2 men.
Yeah.
Really, we saw the law changed in Scotland for the better.
Yeah.
Now, you and I both know, when you look at these cases, there's nothing positive ever comes of them, really. You know, You've got one body's in the mortuary, you've got another guy locked up, or you've got, it's all about grief, and there's no good comes of it. But I cling to the fact that in the case of the World's End, at least, the law was changed for the better.
Yes. For future generations.
And that future people will not be hidebound by this archaic double jeopardy thing, which was brought in the days of capital punishment. First of all. And it was
for all the right reasons at the time.
And it was
like much of it was.
No, and it was meant to curb the excesses of a cruel monarch who you didn't like the look, cut of your jib, and so kept putting you before the court until they found guilt.
Until you got the right verdict.
So it was there for all the right reasons, but with the developments in forensic science, it was archaic.
Yes.
And a lot of other jurisdictions have changed, European, England, Wales. We hadn't. And the World's End case put that right. So long and the short of it, that's how I started writing.
Right.
It was because I felt I had to write that book, and I felt I had to set the record straight, and I wanted to be the person that wrote the history of it. So
tell me just a wee bit about that process of something we've never discussed on here is how you would jointly write a book. What's the day-to-day process of that? Do you send stuff back and forward to each other?
Yes.
And so a chapter in the book, is the chapter co-written?
No, not always. What we would do is we would write individual chapters, and then I would edit and have the last word because it was my name on it associated with it. And David was super, absolutely super, and a very, very talented and skilled writer. Wrote a very, very good book about the Lockerbie air disaster. Right. In fact, the best book written about Lockerbie, I think, was written by David Johnson.
Is David Eck's job?
No, David was the director of Radio 4th.
Okay.
So he was a journalist, radio journalist.
Yeah.
Now retired. So he...
That's good because he had a different slant on it.
Totally different slant.
From a media angle too.
That's right. But it was still difficult. Now he's gone on to write other stuff on his own, as have I.
He's never combined that yet. I'm the interview David next. He
might have a different version of events. So that was the start. So that gets you started, and of course then you become known as a writer, and then you get asked to do other things. And I started to write shorter pieces, and I was asked, some of which were printed in newspapers, the Scotsman, the Herald, the Times, and on justice issues. And then I got asked by the Scotsman to be a columnist for the Scotsman. Right. That's about 4 years ago. So this is after what I should have said was that after the second trial, the World's End trial, I wrote another book about the World's End, which was half of the old book and a new tale.
Updated.
I updated with a new title.
On your own. We know input for that.
No. Much of the first bit was still as it was.
Yes.
So I wrote the second book, and that came out in 2013 or 2014.
Yep.
So there we are. So then you start to get asked to do other things. I start to do this column in Scotsman. And for people who are listening to this who aspire to become writers, writing short pieces of 600 words is, I think, a very, very good way of learning how to write, how to write lean language, stripped down language. But you'll see an awful lot of people make the mistake of too much verbiage, and keeping to that discipline. I call it tyranny, the tyranny of 600 words. Actually,
you've still got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Precisely, you've got to tell the whole story in 600 words, and it's not a lot of words. And you can't go over your word count, and you can't go much under your word count. So it actually makes you a better writer.
Yes.
I mean, some people are no doubt superbly, naturally talented, but for me, writing is a craft which the more you do and the more you practice, you get better at.
Yeah, for sure.
It's similar to that.
For sure.
So then I started writing longer form stuff. So I would write sort of 2,000 words pieces on stories. Yes, which would get, a lot of them were published in different magazines, some online magazines. So
with crime underlying.
Yeah, it's mostly
society.
about crime, society, some historical. Yeah,
the law. So your column is still ongoing, still enjoying it.
Yes, I am. I mean, it's easy to write, but the difficulty is coming up with something new every time. But it's absolutely amazing how, first of all, how it improves your writing, and my writing is improving.
Again, it could be succinct. I take it you're tailored to how many columns you can write. Yeah.
Because we live in a world now of short chapters and short sentences. So, to get your point, to, hard-hitting vocabulary, stuff like that. So it's good for that. it's fairly onerous to come up with new ideas all the time.
Yes.
But, and of course, it's a distraction
Mhm.
from other projects you've got.
Yeah.
You can use it as an excuse for not doing other things. But, so I enjoy the short form 600 word stuff. I'm also enjoying the 2,000 word pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about, it's interesting. A lot of people ask me, why don't I write crime fiction? With my background, why do I write crime fiction? And I always answered, why would I, when crime fact
The real thing.
is so much more interesting?
Oh, yeah.
I've just written a piece which is going to be in a magazine next month, and it's about the life.
What's the magazine, Tom?
It's a 1919.
Okay.
It's the magazine, the online magazine, which is a police and social justice magazine.
Right.
And I think it's sponsored by the Police Federation, which is why it's called 1919.
Yeah.
So anyway, they're really good enough. I had 3 or 4 pieces in that. But this is about the life of Percy Sillitoe.
Oh, yes.
Now, Sillitoe was the
hero of mine.
Yes, right.
Yes.
Well, now,
Sillitoe Tartan and all that. Yeah.
Sillitoe starts as a choir boy in St Paul's Cathedral,
Right.
He then becomes a Rough Rider in the South African Mounted Police. He then becomes, where he learns about the suppression of gangs, incidentally, poaching gangs and tribal gangs. He then becomes an intelligence agent in the First World War in Tanganyika. Okay, now wait for it. So he then comes back to Britain, becomes the Chief Constable of Sheffield, where he smashes the gangs there, including the famous Peaky Blinders that we all know and love now from TV. Comes to Glasgow in 31, closes down half the police stations, sacks half the old senior officers, invests in radio cars, invests in forensic science, takes on the Billy Boys and the Razor gangs of No Mean City, smashes them, gets Glasgow, then goes to the county of Kent as the Chief Constable, just before the invasion on 1944. So he sets up all the pre-invasion security in the county of Kent. He then gets appointed to be Director General of MI5.
Right. I don't know this.
Yeah. And his last great mission was he takes on a job for De Beers, the international diamond merchant, who, because they've got a diamond smuggling problem in Central Africa.
Yep.
And this is 1947, 1948, after the war. So he does that. Now, if you made up a character like that...
That's right. Fictional character.
People would dismiss it as being outlandish.
Yeah.
And yet this guy did all these things.
Real.
And the reason, of course, that I first came across him was because he is really the father of modern scientific forensic policing in Scotland, because he invested heavily when nobody else was doing it. He invested heavily, started the Glasgow Fingerprints Bureau, subsequently become SCRO, of course.
Yes.
And did all that stuff. Got other forces involved, got Edinburgh to specialise in crime scene photography.
He really changed. There was a whole paradigm shift about policing because of Sillitoe, even the uniform.
Totally.
Because I remember reading somewhere that at that time, the council workers, if you worked for the council, you wore the same outfit.
Yeah.
And that's where the Sillitoe Tartan came in. He wanted the police to stand out.
That's right.
That people could identify you as a police officer.
He borrowed it from some of the Scottish regiments, the checkered band.
Yeah.
He first of all he used the mounted branch, Glasgow's mounted branch, against the gangs, the major gangs in Glasgow, many of whom had religious affiliations, the Billy Boys and and they were called Sillitoe's Cossacks, and they used to gather in huge numbers and intimidate the police. and
so the horses were the thing.
He would send in Sillitoe's Cossacks. And he had this the doctrine. Oh, listen, this guy. The doctrine of reasonable force, which was open to interpretation. But he also targeted development of criminal intelligence, development of informants.
Forensic.
He really did set the whole thing up.
Yeah.
And there was one gang leader that he couldn't get, and eventually, after long surveillance, they arrested him for being drunk in charge of a child.
Okay. Yeah.
it's just Al Capone and tax evasion.
Yes.
Didn't matter. The point is that he dropped that leverage. Yeah. So I would.
Did he have a kid?
yeah. There was a child there. There was a child present. You know. But I mean, the point is, fascinating character.
Yes.
And you literally couldn't make a story.
No. So why would you bother making up a fiction? No, is there a book coming about Sillerton?
Well, I've written a long piece. I've written that 2,000 words about him, which is in this magazine.
Right. You know, we've got a short story competition coming up. Are you aware of that?
No, I didn't know that.
Entries by the 1st of December. Right, okay. But it's £2 an entry.
£2.
So that might be.
Don't know if I can afford that.
Very excessive. And you're allowed 5 entries. It sounds like you've got your entries already. Just put them in.
I've got quite a few of them, yeah.
But they mustn't have been published already. That's one of the catches.
That's stymied.
So what strikes me, Tom, is this enthusiasm for, and there's so much to do. Mm-hmm. And when I met you, was that your second book then? Sorry, you did the 2 books about the Mile End murders, but the Ruxton book came out of that.
Yeah, well, it did in a way. In a way, it's separate. What happened was that in the early 2000s, when I was the DCC, I was given a pile of old papers which were found in the West End Police Station in Edinburgh, and they were in the bottom drawer, and they were a big old dusty folder, and they were found, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they found their way to me, and I was to look at them and authorise their destruction, basically.
Okay.
And when I read them, I thought, oh, these relate to the famous Ruxton murders. Now,
and they were lying in a drawer.
If you'd lie in a drawer,
almost 100 years later.
Yeah, but what happened was they had belonged to an old detective, a man called John Sheed, a detective lieutenant in Edinburgh, who, and I've now done a lot of research on Sheed.
Of course.
And he's a formidable character, this guy. Gallantry medals, Scots Guards, First World War, and the pictures of him, he looks as hard as nails. and he was as hard as nails. So anyway, these were his papers, which were in the loft of his house, and he died in the 1970s. And he lived to a ripe old age, died in about 1971, and the papers were handed into a police station. By his family. They didn't know what to do with them, handed them to the police station. And they looked at them and they put them in the bottom drawer. And then eventually they found themselves to me. The funny thing is, I looked at them and I thought, the Ruxton case, I know all about that because I've, detective training in the forensic science. And it was I put them in my bottom drawer. And so years later, when I came to be leaving, I dug them out. I thought, I'm going to read them, and I'm going to shred them because they're about the Ruxton case, and I know all about the Ruxton case. Well, I read them and discovered that I didn't know about the Ruxton case, and there was stuff in these papers which were completely new, absolutely new. And a couple of things come from this. One is all history is partial. All history is written from a point of view.
Usually the victim.
That's right. Yeah. And that actually, if you dig in, you find there's another complete story.
Yeah.
And I found out there was...
As police officers, we know that. Yeah, it's always perspectives.
Yeah. Well, there were people who had been written out of the story. There were people who had been remembered, like Sillitoe.
Of course.
Sillitoe's remembered for a black and white checker band.
Right.
Hell's teeth. Sillitoe deserves to be remembered for an awful lot more than that. As really is the father of modern policing. So I decided then, a bit like The World's End, I thought, I've got to write this story. So I sat down, and it took me a year to research it. I got documents from all over the world. I got a book from South Africa, which was long out of print, and I found one online, and I got it sent to me from South Africa.
See those papers, Tom?
Aye.
Those original papers that had been lying about lofts and whatnot.
Yeah.
Alan Nichol talks about in the Sheila Gavry, in the Peter Manuel case, he did his research and he came across rolled up papers with an elastic band on them with the trial notes.
Yeah.
And when he took the elastic band on, it became obvious that they had never been opened since the trial.
Aye.
And that kind of gets the hair standing up on the back of you. Did you get that feeling once you realised what was in these?
Very much so.
Yeah.
And these are, do you remember in the old days, we used to do telephone messages?
Yeah.
So if you had a telephone, just to explain to the audience, if you telephoned another force, you had to literally write verbatim what you'd said to the other force and what it said to you. Mm-hmm. And therefore, I've got telephone messages there. So I've actually got the voices of the men involved. I've got the voices of the men. And also there was letters. There was letters involved. John Sheed had been the contact man in Edinburgh, so he'd liaised with the forensic science at the university, but he also liaised with the family of Bella Ruxton, who was an Edinburgh girl, right? Although the murders took place in Lancaster. So I've got letters, original letters, written by Buck Ruxton to his sisters-in-law. I've got her documents. I've got stuff that's... And it said, when I opened that file, nobody had looked on these papers for 85 years. And so I had to tell this story. So I sat down, so I got all this data, and I ended up, believe it or not, after a year, with 1.5 million words.
For goodness sake.
Right, so this is the challenge for people writing true crime in cases. The challenge then is...
Or any story that's
how
true.
How do you condense that into a story? How do you get that to 100,000 words, you know? And that was clever, and that took me another year. So the whole project took me 2 years. But I have to say, I'm very pleased with the result of it, and I'm very pleased with the reception side. It's done very well. It's doing very well.
Yes, continues to. We'll come on to that again in a minute or two. Because that process of bringing it down and bringing it down, when I wrote the 10% during lockdown, actually, that's why it was written, I thought when I made that final full stop, the end, that was it done. And when Sandy Jimison phoned me up from Ringwood and said, the good news, we're going to publish a book, I thought in my brain a couple of weeks later that it would be on the shelves of all the bookshops. I didn't realise that the process was only just starting. But you had a process before that you got to that to get it from 1.5 million words to get it down to 100,000. So you had to throw 14/15 of it aside. That's the hard bit of writing, isn't it? Is what to leave out, what not to put in the page, and how to know when it's finished.
That's right. Especially for an ex-cop. For an ex-cop, it's really difficult.
Because everything's important. And for any creative process, how do you know when a painting's finished or when a piece of music's finished? And it's really difficult to discern.
I know.
So I suppose you have to then put the story timeline down and pick out the parts that take the story on a stage.
Well, that's right. I mean, I started with a chapter layout and then, with a few lines in each.
So it's like a storyboard.
Yes. Yeah, built it from that. And tried to, I decided what I would emphasise and what I would not. And I wanted to try and emphasise, because there's been a lot written, some of it, frankly, awful, about the Ruxton case. And so I wanted to take a much more thoughtful approach.
I suppose one of the benefits of a true story is you've got the beginning and the end.
Yes, right.
You need to decide how to word it and what voice to use for it. But you could write the ending at the very start and you know where you're heading to.
I did. The Ruxton book starts in the condemned cell.
Right.
Where he's
of course,
behind.
Yes.
And so it starts there. Yeah. So there was no point in doing otherwise. And then I tell the story.
Yeah.
So it's done well. It's a good story. But again, coming back to your thing about publishing a book, getting a book published. So you imagine that you write a book and it's well received and it's published, and then you walk away and you take a holiday and you write another book. Wrong. Absolutely wrong.
I never really finished that train of thought.
No, that's right. Wrong. Because you've then got to you've then got to service the book. You've then got to promote the book. You've got to watch out for interest. You've got to watch for plagiarism. You've got to watch for people stealing it, because they will. And so you've got to watch all these things. And
the process of getting it to print with the proofreading.
Yes.
I was so bored of my book by the time it got to print because I was having to read it so many times.
The trouble is, though, that's when you make mistakes.
Yes. And I say to people all the time, don't self-edit. There's a lot of self-publishing goes on now, which is understandable, and a temptation for a lot of people. But I say to them, please, please, please get someone else to help you edit it, because it's amazing. I've just had my first experience of proofreading.
Right.
Have you ever tried proofreading someone else's work?
Not really, no.
If you can imagine, and Sandy said to me after I had proofread the 19 chapters that I was to do, the first half of the book, because we split it in two so that both ends of it get attention, so you don't get fed up and your eye skips across things. But he said to me, and are you enjoying the book? And the first time I proofread it, I wasn't reading the book.
Mm-hmm.
That was my mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for mistakes. I was checking the spelling. You need to read the book first
Yeah.
and read it properly, because there's 2 or 3 different ways of reading it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it's quite a pro. Then you have the proofreading, which all comes back to you as the author.
Right.
Then the editing process itself, or before that, the editing process.
No, I have never done that, and I don't think I'd be very good at that, to be honest with you. I sent it away to be professionally edited,
Right.
and spent the money on it. And then
This is Ruxton.
Yes,
Right.
and then I self-published Ruxton because I didn't want. I found dealing with publishers. No, I'm not talking about Ringwood now. Publishers.
Present company.
Except I found it extremely difficult, because the whole world of publishing has changed very much now, and an awful lot of publishers. Now, I published a book. I published The World End, so I was a known writer, and I had a publisher for that. But the whole thing was just taking so long, and I thought I had a good idea for a cover. I was content with the editing of it, and I thought I'm just going to self-publish this book, and which I did, and then it got picked up.
Right.
Several people were interested in it, and I plumped for Ringwood because they were a small Scottish publisher.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to commend, people who you have a personal relationship,
Yes.
rather than just pitching it at some huge company.
Yeah.
I mean, I published the World's End book, and without naming names, I found, going with a big publishing house, unless you're a big name, you just get lost.
So Ruxton is now about to have a new life, all of its own. That's what the podcast that we've been referring to. That's where that's standing.
Yeah. Well, what happened?
How did that come about?
Well, what happened was I got involved in an American podcast company called Small Town Dicks. Now it's a strange name for Scotland, but it means Small Town Detectives, and it's a podcast which has become extremely popular, and it's interviewing detectives and ex-police officers about their cases.
Yeah.
And I did 2 or 3 podcasts with them about the World's End and about the Robert Black case. That's kind of known as Susan Maxwell. Cases I've worked on.
Yep.
About the Sheila Anderson case, which was the unsolved prostitute murder, which brought about the sex industry stuff. And I said, and then I started to speak about Ruxton. And they sort of said, well, this is such a good story. I mean, it's got everything. It's like CSI meets Agatha Christie. And I said, well, I've written a book about it. And so I sent them a couple of copies of the book. So they came back to me and said, look, we'd like to buy the rights of the book, and we'd like to make a multi-series podcast of it. Mm-hmm. And hopefully that will lead to a TV drama documentary.
Okay.
Because that's the way it's working now. Very few books go straight from book to television.
Yeah.
They go via podcast. Podcast is the big new thing.
Yeah.
So that's an ongoing process. They're lovely people. They're based in the United States and all over the place, and it's fascinating. So I've got my kit set up in my writing room, and I converse with California and Sacramento and all over the place regularly.
Enjoying it.
And thoroughly enjoying it.
And that's your podcast. I take it's quiet in there then. You could throw everybody out the house.
Yes, it's quiet.
I think that's the main thing, isn't it?
Well, it's quiet, but I mean, there's occasional noise interference. But it's quite quiet. And they've sent me some first-class equipment, very good quality kit, a mixer.
You work it yourself?
Yes, and now I can.
Because I've got all that equipment, but I've no idea.
Well, now I can do it, and it's but there's I've got a technical man too who lives in Sacramento who's really good at it. He can do it.
So the truth comes out.
And it's amazing. It's amazing.
Because I've got all these bits, and my son has said, "Oh, you just do this and just do that." That word, just,
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to.
Do you have a mixer?
Yeah.
Well, that's the tricky bit.
Yeah.
That's the tricky bit. To get that right.
The balance.
Yeah. To get that right, and my guy in Sacramento is absolutely super, and he can actually manipulate my laptop
Yes.
from Sacramento.
From there. Yeah.
I mean,
it's scary, isn't
that's what it is.
Fantastic.
So they're really good, and that's going ahead.
So that's for the future. That's what's coming. That is exciting.
Very much. And of course, what I'm hoping for, what I reasonably expect that Small Town Dicks is one of the leading true crime podcasts now, and gets a tremendous listening audience. Not only on the east coast of the United States, it's a big listening audience around about Chicago, but also an awful lot of listeners in Europe, in Central Europe.
So think about it, it's global, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It really is.
Absolutely.
And I've discovered that just, I don't know, you'll have had it now, Tom, as well. There's emails from Australia about the book, thanking me for writing it, and very touching stuff. People come up to me at events and things like that, thanking you.
Well,
You really make ripples.
Yeah, and people have said, it's amazing people that come forward and say, oh, I'm the grandfather of such and such, so. And just, in fact, I talked about Detective Lieutenant Sheed. His granddaughter has just, in the last month, has just contacted me to say,
these are the real rewards, aren't they?
Yeah.
They make it all worthwhile. So, we're kind of up to speed with Ruxton then, with all the excitement that's coming from Ruxton. What about what you're doing just now then? Because you've obviously got your column. There must be another book coming.
Well, I've got two things in.
There's so many subjects in here.
Yeah, well, that's right. I've got two projects which are on the stocks at the moment, and of course that's the first mistake. Having trying to do two things at once, and I'm trying to do four things at once actually, because I've got the column, I've got these longer pieces I'm writing.
Of course.
And then I've got two books, and the first one.
And your podcast coming up as well.
Yeah, I've got a podcast coming. Well, I'm actually working on the podcast at the moment. So, last week I was on the blower to the States for a couple of hours most evenings.
Right.
Because it's 9 o'clock their time, 5 o'clock my time.
Of course.
So anyway, I've got two things installed. One is a piece of work I've wanted to do for a long time. And that is a book about the sex industry in Scotland, mainly in the East Coast, but not exclusively, and our relationship with the sex industry, and just chart through some of the developmental points. So I've started off with a look at Victorian times and the people trafficking that took place there.
Yeah.
We didn't bring in young girls from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
We brought them from the Highlands.
Yes.
And the people traffickers then said they were coming to Edinburgh and the big houses in Glasgow to be domestic servants, and of course that was a lie. When they got here, there was no jobs for them, and they were straight into the houses of assignation, which were quaintly called. And so we go from that, and we go through the war period. We go to the Sheila Anderson case, which was a really turning point.
This is the Sheila Anderson murder.
Yes.
Was that the early 80s?
83. 83. And then, of course, we start to talk about drugs, because if you talk about sex industry, then you have to really talk about heroin, and you talk about drugs, because they are combined. So I'm doing that, and I'm working on that, and I hope to really blitz that during the winter, the autumn and winter, because I've got a chapter layout.
Can I go back, just rewind it 1 minute there? When you said that drugs and sex crime, or the sex industry, are related, I just want to touch on that, because there's a perception and there's a tendency, because of convenience, to separate these things, to put them into compartments and say, right, let's create a wee squad that will go and deal with that, shoplifting. And there's a wee squad that will go and deal with knife crime. And there's a wee squad. Am I dreaming this, Tom, or when I was a young cop in the early 80s, I seem to think there was only 2 officers in our drugs unit here in Glasgow and Strathclyde, a sergeant and a cop, and they were the drugs team. They were the drugs squad. Do you think I dreamt that?
No, I think it would be more than that in the 1980s. And if you're talking about 1970s, that's exactly right.
Maybe it's when I joined then.
Most of this thing, the sex industry and drugs, allied in many ways, because I remember hearing a very, very senior officer, a chief officer, from a force in the north of Scotland, a city force in the north of Scotland, name no names, who simply said, "We don't have a drug problem because we don't have a drug squad."
Right.
The
So
minute
that's
that you
fair
have,
enough.
the minute you have a drug squad, what you do is you turn
You
over
create the
stones
problem.
and you find these things and you have got to deal with them. If you don't ask the question, then you won't hear the answer. And that hear no evil, see no evil, speak no
Yeah.
evil attitude was to the sex industry,
Mhm.
it was to drugs, and it was certainly to domestic violence.
For
In my
sure.
young
For
years
sure,
as
yeah.
a police officer.
Signing up.
Yeah.
So, so much in there. Mr. McNee famously said that there was no connection between crime and drugs.
Yeah.
They were two entirely different things.
Yeah.
Whereas everybody on the street knew that most of the crime being committed was to feed drug habits at that time in the early 80s.
In a way, he was right, because one of the problems, I think one of the major problems we had right in the early days, and I was there in the 70s when it appeared, was that because the first manifestation of heroin particularly led to an upsurge in acquisitive crime, housebreaking particularly, housebreaking, shoplifting, car theft, all that stuff. So we defined it, we defined the drugs problem as a crime problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a major mistake.
Yeah.
Major mistake. Mm-hmm. And maybe David McNee was trying to say that. I'm not sure. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
But
that's a good perspective on it.
David McNee was not a thoughtless person, and I'd be very, very surprised if he fell for that one, because clearly there's a link. But one of the problems was, and I remember it in the 1980s, because I was a detective inspector in Serious Crime Squad in 1981, and as we stepped forward to try and attack the drugs trade, so other people stepped back.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And we found ourselves fighting the war against drugs, which was a nonsense. It was a nonsense. Because the laws of supply and demand came squarely into thing. Now, when I was in the Serious Crime Squad, and I know that Strathclyde was the same because I worked with your Serious Crime Squad, the drug squad, we were actually really, really good at catching drug dealers.
Yeah.
We used to, it was like fish in a barrel. We locked up hundreds of them. Did it make any difference? Not a bit.
Well, we did.
How?
We kept feeding the problem. We kept giving more strength to the violence and to the enforcement on the streets.
All right.
So we actually made it worse.
Did it make any positive difference? No.
That's the hard thing to say to cops these days, is that what you're doing and what we bill as success on the streets, with hindsight, we can see clearly that what we were doing was creating the organised crime gangs that we now suffer. Because the more we ostracised people from the system, the more we tried to enforce prohibition, the further we dug the hole.
Well, precisely, and this notion, and then we had all this simplistic stuff about just say no.
Yes, education became the big thing.
I remember seeing all this, and these people going about in these bits, just say no. A complete misunderstanding of what addiction is about.
Totally.
A complete misunderstanding, because it defined addiction as being a bad habit.
Yeah. Even call it a habit, wouldn't it? Even call it a habit.
It's a bad habit. So just give it up. Just say no. Just give it up.
Yeah.
Wash your face, put on a clean shirt and go and get a job. This simplistic nonsense, which went on for years and years and years and years.
And still goes on.
Well, I'm sorry to say you're right.
Because there's still that mentality, and we hear it every time we go on the radio or anything to make the case for what we're talking about. The TV, the media companies try and find someone to argue. In fact, they come up with your old boss. I don't know if he was your boss, Mr. Oliver.
Well, he's dead now.
Is he dead now?
Your Oliver died.
Well, that was 2 or 3 years ago. I was on STV, and that's who they came up with.
No, Oliver was never my old boss.
Was he not? No. Because, and they were asking me, is there anybody you can point us to try and give a balanced viewpoint? But the balanced viewpoint isn't there because it's so common sense now, isn't it?
That's right.
It's so counterintuitive. To most of us, anyway. And just now I'm looking at cannabis and why prohibition came in with cannabis back in 36, and it's all politics and money at the end of the day.
But it's funny you say that, because some years ago when I was doing the drug policy stuff, I had a very interesting chat with some Dutch drugs policy people, and I've always looked to the Dutch. They're actually quite interesting. They're always a little bit ahead. They're not unlike us culturally in many regards. But so I said to them, so, where do you see the threat coming from? Because at that time, cocaine, psychostimulants were coming in big time. Heroin in the east of Scotland comes and goes, always there, but comes and goes. Like a wave, and we were getting a lot of psychostimulants, a lot of cocaine. And I said to them, so where do you see your threat? And they said two very interesting things. First of all, they said, drugs education, concentrate on people up to the age of 16 and don't bother about people that are older than that. If you can't catch them by the time they're 16, you won't catch them at all. So concentrate on your children, which I thought was common sense. The other thing they said was the biggest threat that they foresaw was young people using very strong skunk cannabis mixed with alcohol. And the mental health consequences of that. Now, after I left the police and after I did all that stuff, I was asked to do several domestic homicide reviews, cold case reviews in the north of England, in the Newcastle area. And I got into, it's just one of these things I got into, but it was very interesting because I was looking at these old cases and I would go, where could there have been an intervention earlier, etc., etc. And the number of times I came across, I dealt with one particularly harrowing one, which was a double murder where a young man had he'd been okay, he had some learning difficulties, been fine, living with his father and his grandmother, gone to London to a college and was getting on his feet. And when he was there, he developed a very, very heavy cannabis habit, mixed with alcohol. Came home one Christmas on holiday and had a psychotic episode and murdered both his father and his grandmother. And then I started to look a bit at cannabis psychosis, and I started looking at it. And the Dutch folk have got a point. And the trouble is I went to see various politicians about it when I was doing the drug thing, and I could see what they were thinking. They were thinking, cannabis is okay. I did cannabis at university, and I used to say to them, I know what you're thinking. We're talking about something that's 50, 60, 100 times more potent
than what you're talking
about.
What you were using.
What you're talking about. We're talking about something different. And I think we have still got to. We will still face the consequence for mental health. And permanent damage.
Strict regulation. Strict regulation.
Yes.
People think cannabis or marijuana is just a generic term for one thing. The amount of different plants and oils and derivatives of the hemp is almost limitless. They're still inventing them.
The other thing, Simon, we've got to look at, and it's a very strong view of mine, is that we have got to look at the contribution to our appalling drug death of prescribed drugs.
Because the drug users on the streets use them. They use them with each other to supplement their drug use, the same as they do with alcohol.
Yeah, but the trouble is, some of them have a half-life. So a very interesting conversation I had a while ago. They were saying that if you some of the prescribed the morphine, the heroin substitutes that are prescribed medically, a lot of them have a much greater half-life in the system than street heroin. So in other words, you take some of that and then you mix it, and that's where your overdoses come.
It's the cocktails.
Yes, it's the cocktails. It's the mixture.
And then you get interference. It's the old unintended consequences when the government decided to tell doctors not to prescribe that anymore. What they fail to realise is that street users will go and get a hit wherever they can. They're not discerning about what they use generally. And if we cut off a supply of one thing, it doesn't mean nobody's going to use anymore.
The wisest thing I ever heard, I had a conversation with an American academic about this whole business about drug policy. And he said to me, he said, you know what? He said, in Scotland, he said, you're really good at producing good, sound drug policy. But you never implement it. He said, in America, we're terrible
opposite,
at developing policy, and then we implement it. It's and I have seen this cycle go on time and time again. There seems to be no institutional memory.
No.
And so we have to make the same mistakes as going forward. We're doing the same with the sex industry right now.
Yeah.
We are driving the sex industry underground, out of sight, and into danger on the basis of the gender war. And it's all about the dignity of women, etc., etc.
Okay. So we don't talk about that.
It completely ignores the reality of the sex industry. And I think now, I mean, David Strang, who is just chairing the drugs test, I worked with David, I know David, and I have very high regard for David. I think the whole business about drug deaths task group is wrong-headed in that we should not be looking at how people die, but how people lived, because there's the clue.
Yes.
And some years ago, when we only had, in Lothian, we only had 50 drug deaths in the year, I had the opportunity to sit down and look at each individual death report.
Right.
And you know what? Drugs were on the death certificate. Actually, these people had died of a whole lot of other things.
Yeah.
And many of them, Simon, had simply given up the will to live.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which one was?
Yeah.
Because
the drugs was a symptom of that.
The drugs are symptoms of that. The drug was a contribution to that, but you might as well have it. And it's convenient.
Yes, to categorise them all.
Yeah, it's like COVID. COVID's a convenient for the death certificate. Everybody died of COVID.
Yeah. Nobody died of flu that year.
Yeah, spooky that, isn't it? Yeah. Nobody died of old age, they just died of COVID. So you get this, you died of drugs, but actually how did they live? And what you find is they became isolated from their families. The only relationship they had was with their care worker and their dealer. That they had myriad
institutional backgrounds, care, abuse,
myriad other physical
mental health problems
as associated,
prison,
depression, prison,
Yeah.
And so to look at that simply through the prism of drugs is to miss the point.
Yeah.
It's to miss the point.
It's a fantastic quote that I'm going to use on my Twitter account tonight, by the way. I need to paraphrase it, of course, because I won't remember. But it's not how they died, it's important. We need to look at how they live.
How they live.
Because that's Copenhagen, different places have now got safe places, safe consumption rooms, where people can go and access proper drugs, for starters, not street drugs that we don't know anything about from criminals, but not only the drugs, they can access community, they can access resources to get themselves a wash, get a bite to eat, and get some advice about housing or whatever the particular problem is, usually homeless or bouncing from city to city. It's that chaotic lifestyle that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and of course that's the benefit of methadone. Methadone is the first step on the ladder to take you off that chaotic lifestyle.
Yeah.
The problem for me with methadone is if you stay on it too long.
Yeah.
It's like a tourniquet round your leg.
Yes.
It will save your life. And if you leave it on too long, it'll kill you.
Yeah.
We prescribe in Scotland an awful lot more methadone than they do anywhere else. And we've got to stop and ask ourselves the question why. Because of the half-life of methadone and the contribution on these death certificate of methadone.
Yeah. Lots of stories down there, Tom. But let's get back to the authorship then.
Yeah.
We don't want a spoiler here. So one of your projects is public service.
Yeah.
That's going to be the book. Is that the working title?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. It's stories and voices. And what
Where does that come from? A public service, that phrase?
Oh well, it comes from a famous quote by a legendary Edinburgh madam. Yes,
right.
Who when she was every time she was charged, she always pled guilty to protect her clients, and she would always say to the sheriff, I am providing a public service.
Right. What did the sheriff say? Have we any record of that? No.
Well, the sheriff was
probably knew it.
well, who knows? But she was fined, and then she would fine. She'd pay the fine in cash, and then there'd be an after trial party. Yeah. In the Deacon Brodie Tavern, at which various Ken Speckled characters.
That's what you were saying about fiction. Why do you need to make anything up when there's characters like Dora?
You can I've actually written a piece about her too. But I think that I would like to see that as a play, as a play,
right. Oh,
as a play, because it has all the elements of a.
Have you any experience of screenplay?
No, I haven't. But I'm looking for a playwright. And in fact, I spoke to Sandy this morning.
Got one for you.
A playwright, somebody who said,
yeah. His name is Jim Orr. He's been in here. He came in here to talk about walking football, because that's what our podcast is about. We knew that he had this play coming out as well, but I didn't know much about it. But he came in and said, Simon, I've not got much going on, because he's quite a modest guy, Jim. He said, we'll be 10 minutes here and I'll be out the door. An hour and 40 minutes later, we were still going strong. So I'll tell you about him later on and put you in touch with him. Because he's the real deal. His play, Bend It Like Bertie, is his latest one. I've seen it in the Eastwood Theatre. It's done a tour of Scotland, and it's now going into the Pavilion.
And who's the Bertie Auld?
Bertie Auld, And most of it, in fact, all his plays are based around football. Yeah. But that encompasses so much of his society. Interesting character. Yeah. So your other project, The Worst of Times?
Yes, I want to write, and this comes back to I'm a little dissatisfied with how The World's End was left. And while I was investigating that, and while we were in the middle of that, we began to wonder why it was that from the period about 1976 through to about 1986, even 10 years, 12 years, the central belt of Scotland was so heavily visited by serious and violent crime. Right. Now, when you look at the stats for that, was right in the middle of the peak period of the stabbing thing in Glasgow. And Edinburgh.
A lot of strikes, a lot of public disorder.
A lot of public disorder, minor strike, 84, 85. A lot of that. So there's a lot of social stuff. But we had 3 serial killers operating across the central belt of Scotland. And between them, they murdered around about 20 young women and girls. Raped and attacked dozens more. Now, the question is, what was that about in a small place like Scotland? I mean, when I spoke to, I was at the FBI Academy in the late 80s, and I got friendly with some of the behavioural sciences people who are fascinating people. Yeah. And I said to them, "What do you make of that?" And they said, "What, half a minute?" I said, "It's got to be a connection. It's a
they'll know each other.
It's a cartel. They're feeding off each other. This is what's happening here. It's a competition, and all these sort of things."
Because the chances of having 3 separate serial killers within that very small demographic is
infinitesimally small. It's so much so that you would say no. It's beyond statistical probability.
Right.
But that's the way it was, and so I want to investigate in The Worst of Times. There
was no link between them, Tom.
No,
definitely not.
No. We would have, listen, can I tell you, we would have loved to have found a link between them. We would have loved, it would have answered a lot of questions for us. Yes. Were they in prison together? Did they know each other? Had they, any social connections? Not all of them. And anybody who's, and of course you get your usual, I don't want to say tabloid hats, but you get your usual
speculation
and various television programs about
dramatising,
about saying there was a connection and somebody knew the other one's granny. It's nonsense. There was no connection, and we turned the place upside down to try and find a connection. There was not. So it's a very easy question, and I want to write about that. And I don't quite know how that will turn out, but.
Have you started it?
No, I've got a chapter layout.
Right.
But and it's based on the opening paragraph from A Tale of Two Cities. It was the worst of times, it was the best of times, it was a time of reason, it was a time of Well, it's like that. I've always thought that as being the most fantastic opening paragraph of any book that's ever written. And it just and it actually. That's right, because what happened was you had the very worst of times, and then along came Holmes, along came forensic science, along came all the things which actually came to our...
All the tools, DNA, and communications
between
all the forces.
Well, Holmes, I mean, the Holmes system it's very fashionable now to talk about DNA and to talk about forensic science. But if you're talking about the investigation of serious crime, then the home system and the development of the home system was your lifesaver.
Because of the ability to interrogate it.
That's right.
From anywhere.
But you could have an incident room here, and I could have an incident room in Edinburgh, and in real time
we can see exactly the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Live.
And when you compare it with the old card index system that we worked with, I mean, it's a disaster.
Yeah. It's night and day, isn't it? It's just, it's, in years to come, they'll say, you did what?
Well, I tell people when I'm speaking about the world's end, we started with a card index system, which the people who investigated the original Whitechapel Ripper in London in 1881 would have recognised.
Yes.
They would have recognised it.
Because we hadn't moved on from there, had we?
No.
That was it, and it worked.
I mean, we had sophisticated... It worked with small local murders.
Yes.
But it did not work when you had travelling, serial predatory killers.
Covering different geographic areas.
It didn't work. It didn't work. And of course it was cruelly exposed with Peter Sutcliffe from the Yorkshire Ripper, which brought about the Byford Report, which brought about Holmes.
Yeah. Fascinating. So those are the two. Can you do me a favour? Can you get on with it? Because I'm trying to read these books now.
I'll go home right now, Simon, get on with it. No,
You've got too much on. And you're going to be over in America soon. I can see where this is going. Next time I speak to you, I'll have an American accent.
No, I don't think so. The funny thing is, that's the funny thing they say to me on the podcast, American, we just love your accent. What are you talking about? I have an accent. I wish they all laugh politely.
Can you say murder again? There's been a murder. Tiger's got a lot to answer.
Absolutely, Tiger has, yeah. But I mean, you're right in that the apportionment of time, and again, I'd say this to anybody who's wanting to write a book, is don't get distracted into too many projects, as I have been. Yeah. Don't do as I do as I say.
Yeah.
Do
you have a process of writing? I know you're out of it just now because you've got so much on, but did you have a process for Ruxton, for example?
No,
early in the morning, late
in the evenings. I write in the evenings, and if I don't write something of an evening, unless I'm out and about, if I'm at home and I don't write something in the evening, I don't feel good.
Right. Yeah.
Now it can be part of a column.
Yes.
It can be part of a long form something. But something.
Laying down some chapters, do something constructive.
Something. And it's because an awful lot of writing, as you know, is habit.
Yeah. And I say it to people all the time, and Sandy Jimison taught me this when I was starting off to write the 10%, and I would phone him up or say to him, what will I do about this? Just write some more. Tell you what, write another couple of chapters. It's the answer to everything. It's the answer to writer's block. It's the answer to it's just do it.
But it is.
Yeah.
But it really is. And I've met any number you'll have met. Just many people say, "Oh, I'm going to
get this idea.
I'm going to write a book."
Yeah.
And I say, "Well, just go on and do it.
Just get it started.
Just go on and do it." Yeah. And I say, "Don't sit staring at a clean sheet of paper. Just put some chapters down. Write a sentence on each chapter. Enlarge it. Keep the storyline going."
Yeah.
But just write.
Just do it.
Just do it.
I think that's a great note for us to. But I get the feeling we're going to be back doing this again. Certainly at the launch of one of these new books, maybe in 3 years.
3 years, I hope not.
And what's the podcast called again? If people.
Small Town Dicks.
Small Town Dicks. DICKS.
DICKS, yes, and it's Small Town Detectives. In the American parlance, a dick is a detective. Yeah. And it's an excellent podcast. And one of the contributors, I must just tell you this because it's so funny. One of the person behind it is a lady called Yardley Smith.
Right.
And Yardley Smith is the voice of Lisa Simpson on The Simpsons.
Wow.
And she'll
do lots of voices then, because they double up with what.
But Lisa Simpson is her own voice. And she's a listen. I tell you what, she's not just a lovely person. She is very, very astute and wired into all the media stuff in America. A fascinating lady, actually. And but she does
Yardley
Smith.
Smith.
Yardley Smith. And if you
The
Google
most
it,
unusual name followed by
if you see if you mention her name to any American, they'll say, "Oh, she's known."
Yeah.
Because of course,
I can't wait to hear it now.
The Simpsons is one of the most it's one of the most successful
thing, hasn't it?
that's going on and on. But Yardley Smith. So Yardley Smith is behind Small
And
Town
it cuts
Dicks.
across all the generations. The Simpsons,
Absolutely,
you know.
and it's so topical.
Yes,
and
it's bang on.
It's satirical.
Yeah.
All these sort of things. So it's absolutely first class.
Yeah.
But so Yardley Smith, one of the people behind Small Town Dicks, and it's very worth.
Does she play the saxophone, do you think?
Sorry?
Does she play the sax?
I don't know.
At least it's good on the sax.
I must ask her.
It's always
I
been
wouldn't
a
be
real
surprised.
pleasure. Yeah, real pleasure. Thanks very much.
Nice to meet you at last.
Yes.